And I'll be taking the first part talking about really phosphorus management and no-till corn and soybean, and Jason Miller with NRCS will be doing stuff on zone sampling, and so that's how we'll work it, kind of half of each, and so none of us will get too tired then. And so I guess we'll just follow the outline, and then we'll look at some of these plots that Dwayne set up for us this spring, and on starters and phosphorus application, and we'll look at that. I've only got one replicate there that's labeled, but I think we can see some things in that too. And so really, what is a starter? We got this concentration of nutrients close to the seed. That's what I consider a starter, or pop-up, some people call it, and other names too. But that's what I'd call it. And it gives us that Sure, okay. That gives us that rapid uptake, especially of phosphorus right away, that we'd like, and by the primary root system, and that's the whole idea, especially under stress conditions. Boy, if it's a good year, good spring, it's really, you don't see that much phosphorus starter response. But years like this year, it's cool and cloudy for a long period of time, we see a pretty good starter response. And this is one example right here that I got north of Pier. And seen that early, about 3 weeks ago too, and pretty much it's pretty much, I think, due to the phosphorus that he had fairly close to the seed. And so and we've got some back in Brookings too that pretty good responses on this year. But if it's too cool, too wet, too dry, compacted soils, or any kind of stress that limits that root growth, that's when it's particularly important to have those nutrients, especially phosphorus, close. And we need that intake of P fairly quickly in that plant's life. So that's really important. But other nutrients you see in there are nitrogen. That usually comes with the MAP or the DAP or the 1034O. We don't need a lot of N, especially if you put on before you plant for corn or whatever crop. Or if you side dress, that little bit of N that comes with the phosphorus, or that is there already, is usually sufficient to get you by. So we haven't seen a lot of response to starter nitrogen. And a lot of times you put in some sulfur if you've got sulfur problems, and we'll talk a little more about that, and maybe a little zinc. If you got zinc problems, I usually tell people to put on 5-10 pounds broadcast some way, just take care of it, and don't worry about the starter zinc unless you've got some knobby hills that high in calcium carbonate might tie up that zinc with a higher pH. Then I'd put a little starter too of zinc in there. And potassium, if you got K deficient soils, then it's nice to have a little K in that starter as well. Although you need most of it in some other application method. And so why important, or why do we need it? Again, like I said, stressful conditions is when we need that nutrient close, and that early P uptake is important, and phosphorus is not very mobile, so that root growth has got to get to it. And when we talk about that root growth, you see the primary root. I have just pulled these up out here. This is coming off the seed right here, that primary root, and it's going off at about a 45-degree angle. And then about the third leaf stage, it doesn't do a whole lot anymore. The nodal roots, the secondary root system, then take over. And but it's really important for that up to the V3 stage of getting that plant off to a good start. Is that the mic working okay? Yep. Oh, okay. And you see that chart we've got here. You'll see this early growth response a lot with starters, but it doesn't mean it's going to yield more. And we summarized 61 starter studies that we did over the years. That top graph there, you'll see it's either very low phosphorus soil test, medium to high, or very high is what that stands for on the bottom there. And that's that first chart there on the top is measuring early growth response. And so you can see 2/3 to a half give a pretty good early growth response. Even if it's very high phosphorus, we see some of that early growth response. And but when you look at actual yields on the bottom, bushels per acre yield, yeah, if you're low in phosphorus, you tend to get pretty good yield increases, moderate in that medium to high category, but very high, it's really averages only 1 bushel, and most of the time you don't see it. It does about tasseling time, you see a lot of these evening out, and you don't see it. I still like starter though, not a lot, but I still like starter even on our very high. Yeah, if you're really high, like 30-40 parts per million Olsen, you probably don't need anything. But if you're under that, I still like to see it just because you get that early growth response, shades weeds, it prevents some evaporation, so you get that row covered. And so, and some years it does give you a yield bump, but not too often when you're very high.
Parts per million is your medium to your high?
Yeah, and medium to high, it'll vary on your soil test, but with the Olsen, you're talking about a medium of 8 to 11, and high, you're up to that 15 part per million. Very high is over 16, and so that's what we're at. The source of phosphorus there on this chart down here really doesn't matter if we're talking liquid polyphosphate or if we're talking dry orthophosphate. This work was done by...
Jason, can you step out and talk?
So where in the heck were we? Starter sources of P really doesn't matter if it's liquid or dry. They've shown that quite a bit over the years. And where put the starter, we mentioned that, band near the seed. Yeah, we looked at this primary root and coming off at really kind of a 45-degree angle. And that's all most of them do come out. And they thought in the early days, well, if we put a band 2 inches below and 2 inches to the side, that should be about just right for that root to intercept that and get that early season growth. The problem is putting it almost 4 inches deep, it just doesn't work in a lot of years. It's too dang wet, and it can muck it up, it can disturb your seed zone, so hardly anybody does that. And so that's the problem. But over the years, we found that, boy, if you just get it near the seed, it does as well, if not better, than a 2x2. And but there's some problems that we'll talk about there too. This chart up here on page 2, band is more efficient. That's some work we done at Watertown. Really, it was only 3 or 4 years in no-till, but it's an average of 2 years. And if you look at the different rates, and then its yields there on the y-axis, 157 bushels per acre over those 2 years, where he put 20 pounds of phosphate on as broadcast, didn't do much better than the check. But where we banded it 2x2 at planting, we bumped it up 10 bushels, 167. Now, where we bumped it up to 40 pounds per acre, there the broadcast looked pretty good. It looked about as good as the band. So it tells me, yeah, we probably can get by with a little less with band if we have to. The problem with that, if you're trying to build or maintain soil test, 20 pounds usually isn't enough for our yields. And so, yeah, if you got real high soil test, you probably only need 20 pounds with a starter. But if we've got lower soil test, then we're usually trying to at least maintain what we're taking off with our yields. So you can do that for a couple of years if you got real high phosphorus prices. you can cut back and go to a band for a couple of years. It's not really going to hurt you any in yield or soil test levels. But after that, you'll probably start dropping soil test levels. This next chart is some work that we did over the long term with long-term no-till over about 10 years in a corn-soybean rotation. What we're showing here is just corn yields, either at Beersford or Brookings, at different rates, 0, 20, 40, and 60 pounds of actual phosphate. And we either put that broadcast after we planted. We didn't want any incorporation, and we put it right after we planted, or we band applied at planting 2 by 2. And again, this was long-term no-till. And if you look at those yields between broadcast and band, there's not a lot of difference. And so broadcasting that on long-term no-till, we feel works pretty well. And the reason we think that does is the mycorrhiza, those fungi that attach to roots for most crops, they act as root extensions, and they can actually feed at the surface even when the soils are fairly dry. They attach to no-till plants very, very quickly. But if you're on a till situation, the tillage destroys some of those hyphae, and it takes longer for them to establish. So getting that early phosphorus with no-till still works with the broadcast application. And I wouldn't recommend that if we got really good slopes where we could get some runoff or erosion. That might take that broadcast P with it. But for a lot of no-till fields, we don't have a lot of problems with runoff. So that is an option. That is an option for no-till, where tillage it doesn't really work at all, and there's no reason to, because we can till that P in. And so, yeah, where to put the starter? We mentioned 2 by 2, right with the seed or close to it, or like Dwayne does. He puts it in the planting V after the seed firmer wheel goes over it. And so there's a little soil that falls in there, but you're still getting that P starter fairly close to the seed. You can put it, there's some work shows putting it below the seed, maybe have an advantage, or even above the seed. We did some work on this lower left-hand chart here, where we put it either with the seed or 2 inches away, 4, 6, 8, all the way up to 10 inches away from the seed. And it was about horizontal, the same depth as the seed, about 2 inches, not quite. And this measured early growth difference. We just measured the dry weight. And you could see there, no P, it gave us the less weight, but then the 10-inch gave a little better, but not much. Then it goes right on up, 6 for 2 inches, and the best, where it gave you the best early growth, was when we had it closest to the seed, right with the seed. So probably even better than a 2 by 2, but it was really only 2 inches over and at the same depth. Then we also put a 3-inch below the seed, kind of to mimic that strip till, where you're putting that phosphorus below the seed, and that didn't do as well as we expected. You really need to put starter even if you're strip tilling. You're just putting most of that phosphorus down deeper for later uptake, but not for that early uptake. And but we seen all that yield growth. We didn't see any difference in yield. Even though phosphorus was fairly low that year, there was no difference in yield. They all, about time of tassel, they all were about equal growth, and they all produced the same. And then Dwayne and Walt Rydell on that next chart, they put some phosphorus at different placements with the seed, 2 by 2, and surface band over the row. And looked at P uptake early, and then yield. And yield, the surface band right over the row wasn't as good as a 2 by 2 or with the seed. And that's what you would expect in most situations. So that was some data there. And a lot of people ask, how much starter do you put on? And usually 15, 20 pounds of P205 is plenty. You don't need a lot to get that boost. And so that's 30 or 40 pounds of MAP. And so it doesn't take a whole lot. And then the next question is, if you got low testing soils, you usually got to put 60, 70 pounds of phosphate on. And people say, well, as long as I'm putting a starter on, I'll put it all on. And that's phosphorus is salt too. It's not as bad as nitrogen or potassium, but it can influence germination too if you get too much of that there. And so a lot of times we can't put it all there. But there's a number of factors that do affect if you're going to have problems with germination and fertilizer next to the seed. And one of them is crop sensitivity. As we all know, soybeans are pretty sensitive to those fertilizer salts, so wide rows especially, we can't put a lot of P with the soybean. Whereas corn is one of our least sensitive plants, and we can put a lot more phosphate with that. And so, and actually small grains are just below corn as far as sensitivity, but since they're narrower rows, we can put on a lot more because we just got that phosphorus or fertilizer diluted a lot more than if we had wider rows like corn. And the how much you scatter that, if you got a wide furrow like we used to have in some of these small grain seeders, you scatter that fertilizer over a bigger area and you're just diluting it. Whereas if you just got a small V-notch, like we do with most of our row crops, you're concentrating that pretty good. And row width makes a difference. In wider rows, you're concentrating more of that fertilizer with the seed. And distance of fertilizer from the seed, anytime you've got a buffer there of soil between that seed and fertilizer, it makes a lot of difference. You can get by with actually more fertilizer than if you're just putting it right with the seed. And as Dwayne was telling me, most of the planters today do not run fertilizer directly in with the seed. They're putting it like he's doing, where little soil is falling on top of that seed, and so we don't have as much of a problem then. And rainfall after planting, of course, makes a difference. That just dilutes salts. And go to the next chart there. pH makes a difference. Soil pH. If you got a high pH soil, it's usually more damaging if you're putting on something like DAP, 1846O, because that tends to form ammonia in high pH situations, and it seems it's a little more toxic than MAP would be. And so if you got a high pH soils, I'd sure recommend MAP if you can get it, or 1034O liquid source as well. Soil texture, organic matter, lower CEC soils tend to have more problem. One thing, they tend to be sandier, and so you got less moisture there. Drier conditions, you got more concentration of salts. And of course, fertilizer rate, the source of the element, and the analysis all make a difference on and how much you can apply. And some of our data, starters can delay emergence. I compare MAP, the dry, and 1034O, and how much it delayed a seedling emergence. And typically, always, when you put a fertilizer down, it will delay a little bit on emergence. Sometimes you can't measure it, but if you look at it, you can see it. There's a couple of times where it actually did increase emergence, but that's really unusual, and I can't explain why that happened, but maybe we got something mixed up, but there was a couple of times that I've seen that. But usually it delays it. And if you look at MAP at a 12.5 pound phosphate rate, it delayed it only about a half a day. That's about as much as we could measure, but 1034O didn't seem to do anything. And if you go to higher rates, like 50 pounds of MAP or 25 pounds of phosphate, MAP delayed it about 3 days, emergence. And if you had the whole field like that, you wouldn't really even notice it, but it did delay it from the check that much. And 1034O, it was about half that, about 1.5 days. Now, we think that dry fertilizers are a little more toxic is because when a pellet falls down there right by the seed, it tends to dissolve slowly, and those salts are concentrated right there. Whereas you put on a liquid, it tends to disperse once it hits that soil. And so it's a little less salt effect is what our theory is there. And we see that in the lab or in the field, that less effect from some of the liquids. And some of our liquid starters are the lowest germination problems with some of those. And 1034O is one of the good ones. You get a lot of phosphate there, and not much salt damage, germination damage. And this picture down here, I don't know how many have used that, but that's a calculator trying to, with different crops, different starter fertilizers, how much we can apply. How much we can apply with the seed, with different field conditions, moisture, row width, and that sort of thing. You can estimate how much you can put on. And so a lot of people use that. We're in the process of updating that with some new information that we've got for different crops and fertilizers. And so, but the website's there that you can access that. Now, a little bit on the starter study that we've got here, and talk about that. Some soil tests that Dwayne took this spring actually indicated a fairly low phosphorus test, and he's trying to pull these tests down, only 3 parts per million, Olsen. And so it's fairly low, so I'd expect a fairly good phosphorus response from those. From the phosphorus that's out there. And then he's got some pictures of the planter, but he's graciously pulled the planter out, and we'll take a look at that and how that fertilizer was applied. But there's really 4 different treatments that he put out here and repeated in 4 replications or 4 times. And one of those was a P width, and that's a lower chart down here. P width or close to the seed, and like I said, that was put on right behind the seed firmer, and we'll look at that on the planter. Either 0 or 35 pounds of MAP, which comes out to 18 pounds of phosphate per acre. And then the other was a side placed application of phosphorus, where he's putting most of his P for that plant needs. He's given that starter effect by putting it close to the seed, and then he's putting his nitrogen and most of his phosphorus about 3 inches away from the seed with a fertilizer opener. And so we've got combinations of those 4 different treatments. Those are listed there, and that's what we'll take a look at here in a minute. If this were a sandy soil, he's putting about, 228 pounds of urea and 57 pounds of ammonium sulfate in that side band. Comes out to 117 pounds of N, 14 pounds of sulfur. If this was a sand, I would be a little worried. And I guess one of the reasons is this chart we've got down here. This was on a heavier soil again, and it was on a fairly moist soil. And we put urea, which is, again, what he's putting in a sideband, and it's pretty toxic to seed because it forms ammonia, and that is pretty toxic for germination. But what we did there is just either put the urea right on the seed or moved it over in inch increments up to, 4 inches away from the seed, just to see what we'd get for germ and emergence. And of course, right with the seed, it really knocked the heck out of it, as you'd expect. 100% emergence with the 0 rate, and only about 25–30% with the high rate of urea there. Now, when we moved an inch away, the 30 pounds really didn't affect it at all, but the higher rate still did. That wasn't far enough. When we moved to 2 inches away, pretty much all the rates except the high one, I think that knocked it 3 to 4% germ at 120 pounds of actual N. So that's almost 270 pounds of urea, quite a bit of urea there. and it didn't have a huge effect at 2 inches. And at 3 inches, there was virtually no effect from that urea 3 inches away. But again, that was a heavier textured, moist soil. Your dry sands, some spring, I would be a little bit afraid of putting that much on that close. But I think for these soils, we're plenty safe with the rates that he's putting on. And so with that, if there's any questions, try to answer them, but otherwise we can move over and take a quick look at the plots, and then I'll turn it over to Jason. Oh, just one thing here while I got you here. Anybody seen striped corn this spring? Anybody seen some of that? There's quite a bit of around, and yeah, that's a good point. Did anybody not see it? And there's still some around in the north part of the state and the eastern part of the state, and you still see it, but I think a lot of it's disappearing. But you can see it here. This was taken up by Gettysburg, and 2 weeks ago it was really bad. It was yellow and really striped, but now it's starting to come out of it. And so and this is characteristic of sulfur, and typically, but there's a lot of springs we see it. It doesn't hang on as long as it did this spring, but we were unusually cool and cloudy. And I call it more an environmental effect than a sulfur deficiency, because it usually disappears once their soils warm up, and it goes away. Now the exception would be the sandy soils that low in organic matter, eroded soils that are low in organic matter. That hangs on, and the plant still is pretty striped. There it could be a factor. But we've seen this spring, even where we treated with sulfur, we've seen these striping. And so I don't think it's really a sulfur problem, and I think most of these plants on the heavier textured soils would come out of it fine. And it's shown really, the same thing happened in 2003, and we had sulfur plots at Brookings and at Beersford, and sulfur plots looked pretty good, but we seen striping in corn all over the place. And but it came out of it, and those sulfur plots didn't yield any more than those that didn't have sulfur. So most years it'll come out of it. So.
How about soybeans? Have you seen any nutrient deficiencies coming in on some ugly looking soybeans, or
no? Soybeans, it's harder to tell nutrient deficiencies, especially like phosphorus. You'll see a little growth difference if you got plots, but if you get the whole field that's mainly phosphorus deficient, it's really hard to see. But you can get 5-10 bushel on low, very low phosphorus testing responses off soybean. The biggest thing with soybean probably is IDC, or iron deficiency chlorosis, and I'm beginning to see that in some of the lower areas that are getting kind of wet. And that's something that you really got to take care of before you plant with resistant varieties. And soy green, which is an ortho-chelated iron, that has shown some promise to applying that in those areas at least. And so, but that's typically on soybean, that's really the two major ones we see. The sulfur, we don't see it much, and we don't see much response in soybean at all. There could be exceptions on real sandy stuff, but those are the main ones with the soybean. And so, and of course, if you're growing soybean on ground that hasn't had it for 7, 8, 10 years, of course you need to inoculate, because you do see nitrogen deficiency on some of those as well. Any other general questions? Well, let's go in the hot sun and see if we can see a rattlesnake or whatever out there. And so if we would have looked at this earlier, I think we might have seen more differences, but and the hail, of course, really did some problems too. Now you'll always see one row in each pass that doesn't look as good. And Dwayne said that one had its nitrogen and phosphorus plugged, and they wasn't getting anything to the side. So we're getting, I think, a nitrogen response as well, and at this time you'd expect to see that too. And so that really shows up there. And so, but you see that in every pass. So that was that treatment. This one had both 18 with the seed and the 50P, so it got both. But again, I don't see a lot of difference between those two. And like I said, if we would have looked at it earlier, maybe you could have seen something. But at this stage, they're well within that 50 pounds of P in the side, and I don't see a lot of difference. But again, that the stuff we're putting onto the side, that's to help with the phosphorus needs later in the season. The early growth is with that 18 pounds with the seed or close to it.
You see, you said earlier, like you don't see a yield response even though there's a vegetative response. With that 50 in the side, you think that's got a better chance of relating to yield?
Well, I think here, yeah, because we're pretty low in phosphorus. I think if you were high in phosphorus, you wouldn't need that 50 pounds of P. You would lower your phosphorus level, but if you're in the medium soil test level, you really need a little starter, and that's about it. And so that gives you some options too. If you build your soil test up a little bit, you don't have to worry about high phosphorus prices as much, because you can put a little down with the starter, and that should be good for a couple of years. And so this one here only had the width. It didn't have any to the side, and that really, to me, looks pretty good. And this one here is the check where it didn't get any, right next to it. And if I look at these two, I see a pretty good difference there. And I don't know if that's real or just variability, but this strip looks a lot poorer to me than any of them. And so definitely I think we needed P. Like rate of nitrogen is pretty critical. Rate of phosphorus a lot of times isn't. We get a pretty big bang for a small amount of P, but eventually it's going to lower your soil test if you don't put enough on and you're removing more. And then you could run into problems. It's been modified almost every year too, and but he's got some really good ideas, I think, here. He's got his fertilizer openers up front, single disc openers, where he's putting most of his fertilizer, his N and his phosphorus. It's offset 3 inches from the seed. And I asked him about wet soils, and he said, yeah, he bumps it up a little, but he's still getting that stuff covered with soil. And that's important, I think. Then the starter, what I call starter or going close to the seed, is his seed firming wheel is here. That's going into the V notch, and then the dry is blowing down here. And so you're getting some soil probably over that seed, but you're still getting quite a bit of fertilizer there close. And there's probably some that ends up on the surface too, but it's still enough to do the job. And then the closing wheels are covering a lot of that. So that's essentially always putting on his fertilizer. And I like the idea that he's got urea covered because of the volatilization issue. And a lot of times we don't run into it, but this last year where it was so dry in the spring for so long, guys told me, particularly in central and western part of South Dakota, they put it on their wheat early, and they didn't get any rain for a month, and they thought they lost most of their nitrogen, and I believe it. Because they didn't get any response, even where they put on agrotane, which is a urease inhibitor, but that gives you maybe 10, 15 days of protection. But if you don't get rain in that time, you can lose that that end too. And we were so hot and windy, warm for that time of year, and those are the conditions you get that volatilization. And so we can lose it. That's what I like about this system here, putting it on at planting with that phosphorus and away from the seed. And guys will tell me, but gee, they don't want to fill up that much when they're planting. They just want to plant. Yeah, there's something to that, but agronomically, that's a good way. I mean, if you're going to lose a lot of your N and not get a benefit from starter, I think it makes a lot of sense to maybe take a little more time and get that on. But that's how he's got it set up, and seems to be working well for him.